much for being here. I know people are still coming into the Zoom, but I thought we'd get started. Hello and welcome to the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the festival, and even though I can't see you, I'm so glad you're here. We're excited about the festival this year. This is our second online festival and our 16th edition. We're hoping we're back in person next year, but this format has allowed us to bring a lot of new and different authors to the festival, and so we consider that a silver lining. And in fact, it's our biggest festival ever. We have more than 100 participants this year. A couple things before we get started. We're using the webinar format. You probably know about this already, but you won't be able to see yourself. You'll hear us and see us, but not yourself. If you have comments, please use the chat. I can see the chat's already being used. Tell us where you're from, or if you're new to the festival or an old friend. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is another button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen that helps keep the questions organized. Today, as you may know, is Independent Bookstore Day. And as always, we want to support our independent bookstore partners. Links to our partners, the Jabberwocky Bookshop and the Bookshop of Beverly Farms, are going to be in the chat. And they have all the books from all the authors in the festival. We encourage you to support them or your local independent bookshop. We have 2 days of awesome stuff planned, so please come back. I'm going to give very short introductions to our speakers, but you can find more information on them and other events on our website, and I'll also put that in the chat. So we are lucky today to be talking about the book Lions of Fifth Avenue with Fiona Davis. She is the New York Times best-selling author of historical novels set in iconic New York City buildings, and that includes The Lions of Fifth Avenue, of course, which was a Good Morning America book club pick. She's here with Suzanne Leopold, who is the creator of SusieApprovedBooks.com, which is her website for sharing book reviews. Her platform is active across Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and she has accumulated over 10,000 followers. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Suzanne. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, Fiona. I want to congratulate you on the success of the book. It's amazing. I love this book. I think it has universal themes as well as being a historical fiction book. But before we get into the book, for most folks, I wanted to ask, the people ask is, how did you become an author? Is it something that you dreamed of, or is it something that developed later for you?
Oh, that's a great question. Hi, everybody. And I can't believe it. All these people have turned out so early in the morning, including I saw someone from San Diego. So that's impressive. I hope everyone has their coffee.
They're up early.
Yeah. And thank you so much for having us in the festival. We're thrilled to be here and start it off. So I never imagined I would write a book. That was something other people did. And so I started as an actress, and I worked in New York City for about 10 years doing Broadway and off-Broadway and regional theater. Then I went to Columbia Journalism School and got a degree in journalism and started writing about health and fitness and that kind of thing. And it really started when I had this idea for an article. I had seen an apartment at the Barbizon Hotel for Women, which is now the Barbizon 63 condo. I was looking for an apartment, saw one there, and just learned about this interesting setup about how there were a dozen of these old-time residents who were grandfathered into rent-controlled apartments on the 4th floor when the building went condo, and they'd lived there for decades. And as a journalist, I thought, oh, that's a great story. Imagine what the city was like through their eyes over the years, and how the building has changed, how they've changed. But they're very private. They wouldn't be interviewed at that time. And I started thinking, well, this could be a book. And I love dual timeline novels. And I thought, oh, I'll write one. That'll be really, a real challenge. Who knows? I can't imagine it'll get published, but that'll be interesting. And I did it, and it got picked up by an agent and then an editor, and suddenly I was off to the races on this completely different career that I did not expect to come. So I always recommend changing your career every 10 years. I think that's a good way to live your life.
That's amazing. And then the success of that book, did you feel like, let me start looking at buildings, or that was just something that you said, that's my brand, or that's what I'm going to keep doing? Or does that
Yeah.
interest you living? I know you live in New York City, or is that just,
Yeah, my parents are both English, and we would go back to England every 3 years to visit relatives when I was a kid. And we'd always visit these old estates and castles, and I loved how old everything was. The idea that anything that's less than 400 years old there is pretty new, just kind of blew my mind. I wanted to know what it was like in the Middle Ages, what it was like for an aristocrat in the 1800s, who had walked those hallways. And so I think my love of these old buildings transferred over when I was thinking about doing the second book, which turned out to be based in the Dakota, which is this, beautiful, beautiful building on Central Park West. And it just occurred to me that, it satisfies my desire to dig into the history of these grand old buildings and find out what happened back then. And so for me, I could keep on writing these forever because there's always something new to learn and something new that surprises me.
so this book I felt was historical fiction, but yet it had universal themes for women. It was everything to me. And I'm not gonna, there's no spoiler, so I was very careful with these questions. So I know that Laura and Edie were not based on real people, right?
No.
It was not, they were fictional characters. How did you come up with Laura and Sadie while you're researching, this gigantic building? Like, how did you weave them in?
Yeah. Yeah, what I do is I start by kind of going through old newspaper articles that mention the building, reading books about it. So if it's like Grand Central Terminal, there'll be some massive coffee table book, with great photos. And so with this, I was looking at articles in the New York Times that mention the New York Public Library. And I found one from in the 1950s, and it was about the retiring of the superintendent at the library and how he'd lived at the library in a 7-room apartment deep inside with his wife and his 3 children for 30 years. He moved in before it was even opened. It opened in 1911. And he moved in there with his family. His daughter was born in the library, which kind of blew my mind. It talked about how his son used to raise pigeons on the roof, how the kids used to play baseball using books as bases until they got caught. And I just thought, wow, that's great. A family living in the library. I can work with that. And so what I did is I created a fictional family because I love stories that have kind of a plot twist and that are page turners. And so I need the characters to do what I want them to do. So I tend to not base it on real people. But with a fictional family living inside, I can kind of show people about, wow, this actually existed. And then have them do what I need them to do to create a story that kind of moves and has lots of surprises. So that's where that came from. Although I have to say the character of Sadie, so there's 2 timelines. One is 1913, and that's from the point of view
13.
of the superintendent's wife, Laura. And she lives in the library with her husband and her 2 kids, and she's surrounded by all this knowledge, but she wants something more out of life. So she applies to Columbia Journalism School, which is of course where I went, and her world is just blown open. And then in 1993, the other timeline, it's from the point of view of a curator named Sadie, and she's in charge of a rare book collection called the Bird Collection, which actually exists. And she's about to put on a big exhibit of rare books when one of them gets stolen. And she's drawn into this kind of this background of these book thefts that happened 80 years ago, as well as a terrible tragedy that happened to the superintendent's family back then. And so the character of Sadie in the 1990s, this curator, is based on an actual librarian. And I started looking into book thefts, and I learned about this one that occurred at Columbia University's Butler Library in 1994. Where a thief stole $1.8 million of rare books over the course of 3 months. And no one could figure out how he was getting in and out. And he eventually was caught. And the head librarian at the time, who I was able to interview, she went before the judge and asked for a harsher sentence because she said, what he stole it's not just pages and cardboard and covers. these are really important pieces of Western civilization and culture. And people who steal them are damaging the scholarly research that's done. And how the value of certain things like women's diaries, like the Bird Collection has Virginia Woolf's diaries. 100 years ago, that wasn't considered worthy. And today, of course, they're valuable assets in terms of learning about the time period and what she went through. And so I just thought this librarian, her name is Jean Ashton, is such a hero that I wanted to have a character kind of go through that same journey where things get stolen and you start, the staff starts turning on each other, trying to figure out what happened, how this thief is getting these books, and then revealing how they did it at the end of the story. So she's partly based on a true person, which that was kind of fun to do.
Yeah, I loved it. I loved it. And I also appreciated that I felt like Greenwich Village was another character, and especially in 1913. I mean, how did you research that? I mean, the vibe, how did you find the vibe of the women's group? And that was like a whole nother character to me, and it was just perfect. I mean, how did you did you have people to talk to, or where did you find that information?
Yeah, there are some great books written about Greenwich Village in the 1910s. And what surprised me about that was just how forward thinking everybody was. It was very accepting if you were gay, if you were straight. And there were, of course, lots of bohemian artists. And it turned out there was this club called the Heterodoxy Club. And I learned about that in a book I was reading. And then I went and found a volume that was specifically written about the history of the Heterodoxy Club, which was this amazing club of women who would gather every second Saturday above a restaurant on McDougal Street in the Village. And it was founded by a feminist organizer. And they would get together and they would debate and discuss the issues of the day, like birth control, like the right to vote, women's rights. One discussion was about whether or not you should keep your maiden name. And if you do, will that tear apart the fabric of society? These were big issues because at that time, women, there's something called the New Woman. And it was represented by women who wanted the right to vote. They wanted financial independence. And I tried to imbue that in my character, Laura, who, wants to know that she can take care of herself. That's really important. And so the Heterodoxy Club is this, fantastic, lively debate club almost. And it attracted icons like Agnes de Mille, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And it became this really interesting club that then was forgotten, which is interesting. It lasted for about 30 years and then no one really knows about it. And what's wonderful is I recently had a researcher reach out to me because she's considering writing a nonfiction book on the Heterodoxy Club and its history. So I love that that's kind of, reminding people the women were really dynamic and strong back then. It's not like they were all in corsets and wandering around fainting. And that's what I like to capture in the book are these characters who are kind of out of step with their time. And both Laura and Sadie are. So you have Laura in the 1910s, who's very forward thinking at a time when women weren't supposed to be. And then you have the character Sadie in the 1990s, and she's almost behind her times. She loves vintage clothes. She works with rare books. Her advice manual is this book from the 1800s that she discovers. And so because they're both out of step with their time, it adds tension to the book and kind of makes their characters and their journeys a little more dynamic.
I appreciated that because that was where I felt the universal theme, especially with Laura. Being a woman, I don't like trying to get so personal on these interviews, but I've worked and had children. I've stayed home and had children. I think there was one line when she was walking up the steps and it was like, I gotta go make dinner. It was just like you captured her anxiety just perfectly. And I think that I saw in the book the struggle back then is still the struggle today. And I appreciate that. And I've never felt that in a historical fiction book, that there was a lot of these elements that we've come so far, but yet we haven't. And I was blown away by wow, that was going on in 1913. Women weren't just, in an apron. You watch Mad Men and you see, the women are serving the cocktails when the husband comes home. So I appreciated that's still Laura resonated with me because I was like, all right, okay, it's okay to feel that. My job is, do I really want to make dinner for these guys?
Yes,
why is this always why is this always hanging on my head? Or if something happens to the kids, it's like, oh, I should have been there for them. It's
Right.
my, that motherly guilt is still, that was weaved into the book in just a fantastic way, that it was
Thank
just,
you.
it was unbelievable. I felt it was
And
just everything. It was universal. Yeah.
And I think in this time of quarantine where we're making dinners over and over and over, it
Right.
definitely resonates. And, I'm always interested in how things have changed and how they haven't, and the cycles that women go through. And so I remember in my research, I was looking at old issues of Harper's Bazaar from the 1910s, just to see what the ads were like, and, what people were writing about. And I remember finding on one page, there was this whole beautiful essay about the new woman, and what, how things are changing and what she should become. And here's what women should strive for. And on the other side of the page was the latest fad diet, which was called the barrel diet. And what that meant was that you bought a barrel, you took away either end of the barrel, you festooned it with ribbons, and then you'd crawl inside it and roll around on your bedroom floor until you were sweaty. And there were illustrations, like this was a whole diet back then. And it just occurred to me, wow, things haven't changed. Like, women are told, hey, you have to be financially independent and take care of yourself, but you better look good. And it
Right.
just really hit home that, it's smart to keep on bringing these things to life, of what we're kind of told, these mixed messages that we're told over and over.
Yeah, it was just a very unique, to me, it was a very unique historical fiction book with all elements that I just truly related to. So let's get into the research. So this book, how long did this take you to research, given the depth of this book and all the different elements?
Yeah, this book took about 3 or 4 months, and I really do a deep dive. And at this point now, I love to go out and interview real people. So, like interviewing Jean Ashton, the librarian. There's an architectural historian named Andrew Alpern, who is just the expert on all things to do with New York City architectural history. And so I reach out to him and take him out to lunch, and get his thoughts on the different buildings and what I should be doing. And I think that's from my journalism background of being ready to go beyond the internet search and get out there. And I was able, with the New York Public Library, they were so helpful, where they gave me a wonderful behind the scenes tour of the library. I got to see the old apartment, and it's not an apartment anymore. Although I joke around that they should Airbnb it, they'd make a lot
Oh,
of money that way. But I went in, and you could see where the bedrooms were and where the kitchen was, and what the layout was. And that's so helpful when you're trying to visualize a family living there. And then on top of that, what was wonderful is there's a room called the Allen Room at the New York Public Library for authors with book contracts. And so I was able to work on a book about the library in the library, which just kind of blew my mind. And the librarians were, of course, very helpful. I remember at one point in the book, in an early draft of the book, there was a dead body. And it's not there now, but there was a dead body. And I reached out to one of the librarians at the New York Public Library, and I said, look, if you had to hide a dead body in the library, where would you put it? And she wrote back right away. She was like, oh, down in the basement next to the carpenter's room. And we joked around that, she'd never had that question before. And we're probably both under surveillance, but it was just a joy to be able to work at the library on so many levels, and get their input and help. And I think that really helps in the end, because I really need to get to know that building intimately if I'm going to make it work. And sometimes that's really hard. Like, the Dakota, you can't get in there. You can't just walk in. It's very, very secure. And that took some time of getting to know someone who lived in the building, and eventually getting a tour. But yeah, and people are talking in the chat about going to tour the library. Once it's back open, I highly recommend it. They have great docents who give wonderful tours, and you can kind of see all the places where my fictional family hung out.
now, so do you have mentors who have shaped your storytelling? Because you have how many books? Your books are just, amazing. So do you look back and say, who has shaped when you were writing in the beginning, who has shaped your?
That's a great question. When I first started out, I didn't think I could write a book. And so I started taking online classes at Gotham Writers Workshop, which I highly recommend. just to understand how this whole writing thing works. I'd written, articles on health and fitness. So if you needed something on heartburn, I could write that in a minute. But, writing a 90,000 word novel seemed crazy. So that helped. And then, I wrote the first story and the dollhouse, and I sent it to my agent. And she was so helpful because at that point, you don't know what you don't know. And she really guided me through revising it. And we worked very closely together for a good year. And so I would say, Stephanie Lieberman, my agent, was really the first person to come and help me shape it. And then, of course, it goes to an editor. And my editor at Dutton, Stephanie Kelly, was just wonderful in terms of understanding what the book needed and what was missing and guiding me to figuring that out. And so, yeah, Lions is my fifth book. And it's difficult each time. It's not like it gets easier to pull together a story, but I enjoy it so much. And I also have to say, just a shout out to the book community, because there's a number of historical and women's fiction authors in New York who I got to know over the past 5-6 years, and including you, Susie. And it's just so supportive, where if you're having a question about something or a plot point or even something in the industry, I know I have people I can bounce things off of. And they know they can come to me if they have a question about something I might know more about. And that community is so important. And that's kind of a shock when you're in your 50s and you're meeting all these new people that become deep, deep, great friends. And, so that's a gift that this new career has absolutely given me.
So probably your experience from the dollhouse to now is a very different. I think we met when you did the dollhouse, so it's a different world. I mean, the world is very different for you from that debut to now. Yeah. So can you share what you're working on now with everyone, if you're allowed to?
Sure. So the next book is set at the Frick Collection. And that's a little lesser known of a museum in New York City that is on Fifth Avenue and 70th Street. And it's this beautiful mansion. It's a Gilded Age mansion built by Henry Clay Frick. And he lived there for 5 years, and then he passed away, and his adult daughter and wife lived there. And when his wife passed away, it was left to the city. And he was a huge art collector. So there's amazing pieces of art inside, Turners and Renoirs and Vermeers. It's just incredible. And so it's set there in 2 different timelines. And it'll be out in January of next year. And I can't wait. It's called the Magnolia Palace. And that should be fun to get out in the world.
Yeah, that's going to be great. Do you have a lot of say in the cover and the titles? Because your covers are just magnificent. Do you have a lot of input?
Yeah, they are wonderful, and they're so terrific to work with at the art department at Dutton. And so they, I'll kind of say, here's what I'm thinking of, here's what, I imagine this, and then they take it and they run with it. And yeah, we always tweak it as we go on. And so with the cover of Lions Fifth Avenue, though, that was almost perfect. I love the girl in the yellow dress in the cover. For the titles, I'm normally terrible at titles. And my agent, my editor tend to come up with them because that's so important. You want something that represents both the building, but also the story. And so like the Lions of Fifth Avenue, there's 2 lions outside of the New York Public Library called Patience and Fortitude. And they're very famous, and they've been wearing masks during COVID that are, 4 feet wide. They're incredible. And the lions are an iconic part of the library. So using that in the title works for that. And once we came up with that title, I actually went back and changed the name of the family who live in the library to Lyons, Lyons. Just so you had that kind of resonance that it's about both the family and the building, which is fun. And each book has been like that, like the Dollhouse, it refers to the fact that the Barbizon Hotel for Women held all these pretty little dolls. It was the Eileen Ford Modeling Agency. It was the Katie Gibbs Secretarial School. All of these young women who are coming to New York City sought refuge there. So it represents the building in a kind of dynamic way.
Somebody brought up, I couldn't see the question about the professor at the Columbia School. Was that, Any backlash on that?
So I went to Columbia back in 2000. It was the best experience ever. I learned everything about writing and shaping a story. It was incredible. And I started doing research about the Columbia Journalism School, which opened the year before my book is set. And it was co-ed, which was kind of shocking back then. And I found this great book on its history, and it talked about how tough it was for the women. And that the women and the men at the Columbia Journalism School had very different tracks. So the men could go cover murders and politics, and the women were sent off to orphanages. And there was like apparently one professor who would kind of scour the hallways looking for women whose dresses were too short, because he was sure that they were just going to be immoral and, bring down the reputation of the school. And so women were dealing with this nonsense back then. And I wanted to bring that to life. And so, so my character Laura has a really tough time at the Columbia Journalism School in 1913. And I have to say, things have changed. So in 1913, when Laura goes, the school was 15% women. Today, the Columbia Journalism School is 75% women. So things have absolutely changed. And it's just a wonderful program. I'm still involved in it today, and I love the school. So yeah, the professor was difficult. And what prompted his character was to be so difficult was that I wanted to show that the school was tough. If you made a spelling mistake back then, you could be tossed out. Most of the students didn't even make it to the final graduation because you got thrown out at, if you weren't up to snuff. And so with your characters, you have to put obstacles in their way. And the professor was one of those obstacles.
So this book was I'm excited that it was a GMA pick. What was that like to be
That was
interviewed?
hard. It was so hard because you're told about a month before, and then you're told to not tell a soul. And so I didn't even tell my mother because I didn't want her telling her friends. And so I was just so worried that it would get out and somehow I'd be blamed, and so I was very panicky about it. And then of course the book just completely took off because they do so much. GMA is incredible in terms of, announcing that it's the book pick. And then they do a long interview with you, and then they take snippets of that and run like a 5-minute piece a couple of weeks later. So it keeps the momentum of putting a book out going. And I am absolutely in awe of what they did and how they did it. It's wonderful to be part of that machine.
So before we open up for questions, I wanted to make sure you let your readers, anyone on, know where they can find you to buy the book, because it's Independent Book Day. If you want to give the information out where anyone can find you on social, if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please support your local independent bookstore. The ones I love, Books on the Common in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and also Shakespeare and Company on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And yeah, you can find me at FionaDavisBooks.com. And there you'll see I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and, very engaged. And I try and show a lot about my research, as well as share things like what books I'm reading now, so that, because I think people who love the books I write might also like the books that I read. And there's a lot of great historical fiction that I'm constantly devouring. So it's nice to spread the word of what else is out there, because there's so many good books out there.
Yeah, you are very supportive of other authors. You are definitely a champion of that.
Yeah. So I'm popping back on to help with a few questions. And the first one that came right at 9:03 from Teresa, what is the best piece of writing advice you received that you still use?
Oh, wow. What a good question. The best piece for me, and this isn't true for everyone has to find their own way on kind of how to finish a book. But the best piece for me was to plot things out before I start writing. And so, I figure out the two timelines, and I figure out who the characters are, and I kind of outline each timeline, and then I weave them together, which is always tough because you don't want to give away too much in one timeline that gives away the clues in the other. And there are days that my head is spinning and I have to go and drink a lot of wine at night, because that tends to help. But then, then I have a story, a map that I can follow. And what I do after that is I write a very quick first draft, just to see if the story will work, if the characters are flowing, if everything's working. And then I do about 10 drafts on top of that that layer on more detail, getting deeper into the characters' heads. But for me, writing that first draft through and not going back and editing is the key, because I need to see the big picture before I can start making, the details really sing. And so again, it's not for everybody. I know authors who they write their first draft and go back and edit each chapter before they go on to the next one. But for me, I need that momentum to get to the end of the story. Because also it feels like it's you've checked something off a list, first draft complete, done.
Great. A sort of follow-up to that is someone asked if you know the ending when you start, or how long it takes you to get to, how the book's going to close.
Yeah, as I'm doing research, I'm getting ideas for scenes and for twists and plot twists and that kind of thing. And I do tend to know at least a couple plot twists and a general idea of the ending as I'm doing research. And then I do figure them out, because there are 2 timelines. So I want the 2 endings to be different. I don't want them, both to just always end up happily ever after, because that's not the way life works. And so I try to kind of know the endings and make them realistic for the period, for that time period, where sometimes there are consequences for women who go outside the norms, and they can be tough ones. So you never quite know what you're getting with my books.
Another question: with so many incredible buildings in New York City, how do you decide that you have enough for a book about a particular building?
That is, yeah, absolutely. As I start the research, I'm in panic mode, because I feel like, oh no, I have to learn about these 2 eras, the building. There's so much to learn. Say at Grand Central, the book it said at Grand Central, The Masterpiece, it was about an art school. So I had to do all this history about artists and illustrators and painters. And so I'm just kind of panicked and devouring books and watching movies if that works for it, and then there's just a point where I just hit this tipping point after about 2 or 3 months, where I have the story in mind and the story starts taking off. And that's the tipping point when I know it's okay to start writing. And I'll go back and research things that I need to, but it's almost like the story starts writing itself in my head, and I have to catch up with that. And so it's always interesting. And that when you do get that sense of, okay, I know what I've got here, and I know what I need going forward, so I have it under control, is just the best feeling in the world after that panicky early stage.
Right. Have you had any research projects that fell flat, where you thought you were going to do something and it didn't work out?
What's so interesting is I have not. Every building that I've picked so far has just brought up this wonderful wealth of material and secrets and surprises that I just am excited to share with the reader. I joke around that by the 30th book, I'll be doing the gas station on the corner of 11th Avenue,
I'm sure that'll be amazing.
Well, we'll see.
Can't wait.
In the Q&A, there are a bunch of suggestions for books that you could, locations you could consider. So have you ever considered a New York City nightclub, or Carnegie Hall, or what are some of the other buildings that are on your list?
That is so funny you say that, because you work very far ahead when you're writing books. So the book that's set at the Frick is coming out in January, and that's I'm doing final edits and getting it into shape, and already thinking about the next book, which I'm pretty sure is going to be Carnegie Hall. So that's you nailed it. Whoever posted that is
Spoiler.
should get points. Yeah, and so. Yeah, and I'd love to do London. I think that would be fun, to take it outside of New York and find a building there to play with.
Interesting. So these are there's a question about the New York City Library. Are there really dumbwaiters and systems like this in the library?
There are. In fact, the way the library works, and it's still very much like the way it did back then, is you have this rose reading room at the very top floor, where people go to, back in the day, you'd fill out a call slip, and it would go down a pneumatic tube down to the stacks, which is 7 layers of bookshelves below the reading room. And then you have these people called pages who get the slip and run around, find the book, bring it back, and it gets onto kind of this vertical Ferris wheel that they put the books into these trays, and then it gets lifted all the way back up to the Rose reading room. So it's still very much the same way it was. And there are dumbwaiters for the oversized books. And there's a dumbwaiter even in the apartment, the old apartment.
Oh, cool.
Mhm.
So Glee Woodworth, who's on the Newburyport Literary Festival Steering Committee, noted in the chat that Newburyport's Edmund Pearson was also a writer and a librarian at the New York Public Library in the early 90s.
Oh, look at that. Oh, I love that. That's fantastic. Yeah, it was wonderful because the library has all these archives that you can go through. And so I was able to go through, say, the superintendent's, all his records and see, you know, the 90 people that he employed and what they got paid and what their titles were. And so, you know, that they've kept such good records about that era that it's very helpful for someone writing a book about it.
Right. This is more to the book specifically. Can you explain a little about the disconnect in Laura and Pearl's relationship as they grew older? Was there a rift when Pearl goes back to the US for college? Did they reconnect? Did Pearl never want to discuss with her mother about children? Why did Pearl never want to discuss her mother with her children? Excuse me.
Right. Yeah. So what the book is about, and you know, we won't give away any spoilers, but there's kind of 3 generations of women. And so you have Laura and then her daughter Pearl, who's in the 1913 section. And then Pearl is an old woman in the 1993 section with her own daughter, Sadie. And I was very curious how secrets affect generations of families. And that, you know, an older generation can have a secret that then really is destructive to the later generations, even if they're not in on it. That withholding information like that can be so damaging. And of course, Laura and Pearl go through a terrible tragedy. And to me, Pearl becomes the good girl. And so she tries to make everything right. You know, she kind of sublimates all of the trauma and doesn't want to talk about what happened. And then, of course, her own daughter needs to know because she's working at the library and it's part of her job to find out what exactly happened back then. And Pearl at that point isn't able to share any information. And so, yeah, you know, to me, Pearl is kind of withholding all of this information that causes a lot of trauma and passes the trauma on until it can be opened up, the secret is revealed, and people can start healing, which to me, in the end, the family does start healing.
Right. This is a question I had too. What was the name of the New York City women's group that met on the second Saturdays again?
Yeah, it's called the Heterodoxy Club, which is a strange name, but heterodoxy is the opposite of orthodoxy. Right. So it means deviating from society's norms. So the Heterodoxy Club means women who are kind of pushing against society. And yeah, please feel free to dive in and do some more research on it. I think it'd be fun to revive it, actually.
Great. Thank you for that. So a few folks have asked what you're reading right now.
Yes. I just finished. I'm blanking. It's so terrible. I have so many books that I have piled up and have had to go through.
The sign of a reader.
Yeah, you know, the one book that I've just loved is The Rose Code by Kate Quinn. It's, if you like, you know, multiple timeline historical fiction, she does it like no one else, and it's such a good book. I really loved it. And also, I'm just starting Liberty.
Caitlin Green. Yeah, Caitlin
Greenwich. Yeah.
Carrie Greenwich is actually, her sister is actually part of the festival and will be presenting this weekend.
Oh, that's great.
Her book called Black Radical, which is a biography of Trotter, who was a Black journalist in Boston.
Oh, what a pair of sisters. What a powerhouse pair of sisters.
Amazing.
There are 3 of them, and I think the third is also a published author, so really amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, I can't wait to dive into that one. Just the opening line is fantastic. So I know I'm in good hands.
Excellent. What we only have time for a few more questions. One person just asked if you had any advice on finding an agent for writers who are just starting their careers.
Absolutely. Yeah. For me, I didn't know anyone in the industry. It's not like, I had no one to go through. And so what I started to do is going to writers conferences, and going to panels where agents were talking and, learning about that. And so I went to a panel and an agent was talking about how she was looking for strong female characters. And so when I felt like my manuscript was ready for the first book, I sent it to her and specified, I heard you talk here on this date. You mentioned this. I think, if you're looking for strong female characters, this might fit. And I think that was just enough to lift me out of the slush pile, that I made that little extra effort and we hit it off, and that was it. So I would say just getting to know people in the industry, and there's so many of these virtual events, especially like Historical Novel Society has one coming up in the summer, where you can kind of hear about how agents, what they're looking for, what they want, and maybe go through it that way. So you get a little way in.
Right. That's really great advice. And I also, just to put another plug for another event that's happening here at the Newburyport Literary Festival at 2:30 today, someone is going to be, Virginia Hume is going to talk about her life as a debut author with her agent, editor, and publicity team. So please go to the website and check that out, because that'll give some great advice. We only have a few more minutes, and one of our participants has asked Fiona, if you could just repeat the information about your blog and website and Facebook stuff, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I'm FionaDavisBooks.com. On Twitter, I'm Fiona Davis Books. And on Instagram and Facebook, I'm Fiona Davis Author. So
Fiona, do you have a newsletter too that they could sign up for?
Yeah. If you go to my thank you. Nice, Susie. Well done. So if you go to my website, FionaDavisBooks.com, there's a place to subscribe to the newsletter, and I send out notice. I don't overwhelm your inbox, but it's notices on new books coming out, cover reveals, and book giveaways. So that's a good way to know more.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well,
you'll be in the Fiona know. You'll be.
Ladies, thank you so much for joining us on our first, or my first event of the Newburyport Literary Festival for this year. And participants, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll come back and attend some of our other events. We've got a great schedule.